a freezing river, a broken bridge, and a team of soldiers racing against time in total darkness. Explosions light the night. Someone is leaking secrets, and the enemy is closing in fast. They must finish, or fall. But with a traitor among them, who can they trust? The wind howled low through the trees, sweeping cold mist over the cracked road that led to the river. It was late autumn in Western Europe, and the days had grown short, the nights bitter. The war had crawled its way to the banks of the Roer River, a wide, fast-moving current slicing through the land like a wound. On the far side, dug deep into the hills, enemy troops waited, their positions hidden among the rocks and trees. For days, Allied advances had stalled here. Every attempt to cross had been met with crushing force. In the shadow of the crumbling Siegfried Line, a small group of American engineers huddled around a dimly lit map table inside a half-collapsed farmhouse. Their faces were tired, layered with mud and long days without sleep. They were not front-line fighters, but today they had been given a task no soldier could afford to fail. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke stood at the head of the table, his jaw clenched as he studied the sketch of the river. His uniform was stained, the collar faded, and a thin scar ran down his left cheek, an old reminder from an earlier campaign. He was respected not because he shouted or demanded it, but because he always led from the front. He had seen enough of war to understand that courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and often came with a cost. Across from him stood Sergeant Will Hayes, arms crossed, eyes locked on the map with a simmering kind of energy. His sleeves were rolled up despite the cold, and his knuckles were raw from hammering stakes and steel through frozen ground. Hayes didn't hide his anger. He had lost friends in this same region weeks ago. He hadn't forgiven the silence that followed their final radio call, and he hadn't forgotten who held the hills across the river. Next to him, Corporal Levi Stern sat silently, his gaze fixed on the river's sketched flow lines. Stern didn't speak much, but when he did, everyone listened. He had the uncanny ability to remember every turn in a blueprint, every measurement from memory alone. Rourke often said if anyone could rebuild a bridge, blindfolded, it was Stern. A small notebook rested in his hand, covered in water-stained notes and pencil sketches. Near the far wall, Private Tomas Delgado adjusted the knobs on his field radio, his fingers fumbling slightly. He was the newest in the team, young, fresh from the coast and eager to prove he belonged. His Spanish accent still clung to some of his words, and while he often looked nervous, there was a fire in his eyes. Rourke had noticed from the start. Delgado had heart, but heart alone wouldn't get them across that river. Rourke leaned over the table and tapped the center of the map. "This is where we make the crossing," he said quietly. 300 feet, cold, fast, and watched. We start after sunset. No lights, no sound, and no mistakes. Hayes scoffed, shaking his head. "That current's moving like a freight train and we've got half the supplies we need. You're telling me we're building a bridge over that in one night?" "You heard the order," Rourke replied calmly. "If we don't get it done, the whole line stays stuck. And enemy reinforcements are already moving toward this sector. We either get our people across or we give them time to dig in deeper." A silence settled in the room, thick and heavy. Outside, a distant thud echoed through the valley, another shell falling somewhere down the line. Stern finally spoke, his voice soft. "If we use the broken ferry parts near the bank, we might have a base for the first section. It's risky, but it could buy us time." Rourke nodded. "That's the kind of thinking we need." Delgado looked up from his radio. "Sir, communication's patchy in this valley, but I'll keep trying to stay linked with command. If anything changes, I'll know." Hayes leaned forward. "Sir, what if they already know we're coming? What if someone's talking?" It wasn't the first time Hayes had hinted at it. In the past week, too many things had gone wrong. Supplies missing, tools damaged, enemy fire landing far too close to hidden positions. Rourke didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded the map slowly and tucked it under his arm. "We keep our eyes open, we watch each other's backs, and we don't let doubt do the enemy's job." He stepped back and looked at each of them in turn. "We've all been asked to do hard things in this war, but this is something else. If we fail, it's not just us that pays, it's the men waiting to cross behind us. It's the next town, the next line, the next push forward." The farmhouse creaked as the wind picked up again. A shutter banged softly against the wall. "Get some rest," Rourke said at last. "We move when the sun drops, and once we start, there's no turning back." One by one, the men filed out, stepping into the gray light of the dying afternoon. The river waited beyond the trees, its surface churning like a warning. Inside, Rourke stayed behind for a moment, his hand resting on the old wooden table. For a second he let the weight of the mission settle on him. He wasn't afraid of what lay across the water, he was afraid of what might be hiding among his own. That night, under a moonless sky, the team would begin their impossible task, and before it ended, every one of them would be tested, not just by the river or the enemy, but by the shadows creeping in between. The last traces of daylight slipped beneath the horizon, as Lieutenant Marcus Rourke crouched beside a stone wall, scanning the forest ahead. The air was colder now, sharp and damp, sinking into their bones as the sky turned from gray to black. Behind him, the rest of the scouting party waited in silence. Sergeant Will Hayes to his left, gripped tight on his field tools, and Corporal Levi Stern to his right, eyes alert and focused. Private Tomas Delgado brought up the rear, hunched over the heavy radio slung across his back, careful with every step. Rourke gave a subtle hand signal, and the team began moving. Their boots sank into the soft mud as they crept toward the river's edge, shadows stretching long around them. The trees grew denser, the closer they got, the undergrowth thick with roots and frost-bitten leaves. Every snapped twig made them flinch. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then silence. They reached the bluff just above the riverbank, laying low as the flowing water came into view. Even in the dark, the current looked dangerous, fast and strong, dragging bits of broken wood and debris downstream. Beyond it, the opposite bank rose steeply into rocky ground. Rourke raised his field scope and peered across. "There," he whispered, passing the scope to Stern. "Third tree line, follow it left. Do you see the edges of those slits?" Stern nodded slowly. "Concrete bunkers, well camouflaged, looks like 2, maybe 3. They've set up overlapping coverage. If one misses, the next won't." Hayes scoffed, under his breath. So much for slipping across unseen. Delgado knelt beside them, squinting toward the other side. "I thought this sector was supposed to be light on resistance." "It was," Rourke replied grimly. "Either the reports were wrong, or someone knew we were coming." They scanned for another 10 minutes, watching the enemy movement. German patrols drifted in and out of the woods across the river, flashlights flickering briefly before disappearing again. Whoever was stationed there, they weren't sleeping. Just as Rourke was preparing to pull the team back, Stern tapped his arm and pointed downstream. "What's that?" "Near the bend." They slid along the embankment, keeping low. There, tangled in a mess of reeds and branches, lay the remains of an old civilian ferry. Its hull cracked open, half submerged in the riverbank muck. It was rusted and battered, but parts of the deck remained intact. "It's broken," Hayes whispered, "but maybe not useless. Could be the start of something. If we reinforce it," Stern added, "we could anchor the first section of the bridge right here." Rourke nodded slowly, thoughts turning. It might work and it might save us hours. He turned to Delgado. "Mark the spot. We'll check it again tomorrow night." Quietly. Just then, a sharp crack rang out. A high-pitched whistle and bark exploded inches from Rourke's head. "Sniper fire." "Move," he hissed. The team scrambled, ducking and weaving through the trees as more shots echoed from across the river. Hayes spun around and threw a smoke canister behind them, the hissing fog curling into the trees. They didn't stop until they were back at the edge of the woods, hearts pounding, lungs burning. Delgado was pale, gripping his radio like it might fall apart in his hands. Rourke checked the others. No one was hit, but the narrow escape rattled them. "They were waiting," he muttered. "They knew we'd come tonight." Stern caught his breath and looked around. How could they have known? Rourke didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned them back to camp. It was well after midnight by the time they returned to their supply tent, tucked behind the tree line. The rest of the engineering crew was asleep or pretending to be, wrapped in blankets beneath worn tarps. Hayes, still tense, headed straight for the equipment crates, needing something to do. "Where's the steel bolts we packed yesterday?" he muttered, lifting the lid from one of the boxes. "I left them in here, right on top." Rourke walked over and peered inside. The bolts were gone. In their place was a pile of mismatched pieces, some rusted, others clearly not regulation. "Check the next crate," he ordered. Stern flipped open another. A set of support rods had been swapped with brittle, pre-used segments. Hayes stood up, face flushed with disbelief. "No way this was a mistake," he said. "Someone messed with our gear." Delgado looked up from his station near the lantern. Could it have happened during transport? No, Stern said calmly. I checked these 2 nights ago myself. Everything was where it should be. This was recent. A heavy silence fell. Rourke felt the pit in his stomach deepen. This isn't just sabotage, he said quietly. This is inside. Someone's feeding the enemy, telling them where we'll be, what we're using, when we'll move. Hayes kicked the side of the crate. We've got a traitor. Stern leaned against the tent pole, his expression unreadable. Who'd even have access? This isn't just someone wandering into our gear. They knew what to replace and how. Rourke's mind raced. There were only so many people who touched the supplies, only so many who'd seen the map, and someone somewhere in their camp had made a choice that could destroy the entire mission. We keep this between us for now, he said firmly. No rumors, no accusations. If we point fingers without proof, we'll tear this team apart before the enemy gets the chance. Delgado's voice was quiet. So what do we do? Rourke stared into the dark for a moment, then looked toward the eastern sky, where the faintest line of morning light had begun to rise. We build the bridge, we watch each other, and we figure out who's playing both sides. Outside, the wind picked up again, rustling through the trees like a whisper of what was coming. The river would not wait, and neither would the enemy. The sky turned black just as the engineers began hauling the first set of beams down to the water. The moon slipped behind a shroud of clouds, and the wind swept cold across the forest, carrying with it the distant thump of artillery echoing through the valley. The river, wide and furious, roared beneath them, indifferent to the human struggle on its banks. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke crouched on the muddy shoreline, hands stained with grit and rust, watching his team move in near silence. Every movement had to be precise, every tool wrapped in cloth, every breath measured. No lights, no voices above a whisper, no second chances. Use what we've got, he whispered to Sergeant Will Hayes, who was directing a group of men dragging a rusted girder toward the half-submerged ferry they'd found the night before. Get creative. Hayes grunted in agreement. Already pulled a few panels off that busted German transport near the woods, gonna make a brace out of their own junk. Rourke managed a thin smile. That's the spirit. The broken ferry served as the base, a reluctant anchor wedged into the bank like a forgotten relic. From there, the engineers worked quickly to build outwards across the current. Old steel, shattered beams, and even sections of twisted fencing were turned into supports. Cables were drawn tight between the trees and secured to the first set of pontoons. They didn't have much, but they had just enough to start. Private Tomas Delgado knelt several yards up the bank, tucked behind a tree with his radio pressed to his ear. He was tracking any chatter that might suggest the enemy had spotted them. So far, nothing pointed directly to their location, but the occasional distant rumble of enemy artillery reminded them that luck had its limits. Corporal Levi Stern was laying planks with quiet precision, measuring each angle with practiced care. His photographic memory served them well. He recalled every inch of the plans Rourke had drawn up the night before. No notes, no questions, just steady hands and sharp eyes. Then came the first jolt. A shell landed in the trees not far from their position, thudding into the earth and sending a wave of dirt and broken branches into the air. No one shouted. No one ran. They froze for a moment, hearts racing, then picked up their tools and kept working. Random, Hayes muttered under his breath. They're just guessing. Rourke wasn't so sure. The spacing was too precise, as if someone across the river knew where they were, almost exactly. Hours passed. The bridge crept forward, foot by foot, beam by beam. The current fought them at every step, dragging away anything not nailed down. Hayes's boots were soaked to the knees as he balanced on one of the pontoons, tightening a brace with a salvaged wrench. Then came the twist. We're missing a pontoon, Stern said quietly, eyes scanning the shoreline. Rourke looked up. What do you mean? One of the support pontoons. I checked the row before we started. It's gone. A cold silence fell between them. Could it have come loose? Delgado asked, stepping toward them. Unlikely, Stern replied. I tied that line myself. They followed the bank, moving quickly but quietly until they found it half a mile downstream, bobbing in the current, barely afloat. But it wasn't just loose. Someone had cut the ropes and bent one of the metal valves wide open. The pontoon had been sabotaged. Hayes stared at it, jaw clenched. That's no accident. Rourke agreed silently, feeling a fresh weight settle in his chest. The night was hard enough, building under fire, under pressure, but now, they dragged the damaged pontoon ashore and tried to salvage what they could, but time was slipping fast. Without it, the bridge wouldn't support even a single vehicle, and dawn was only hours away. Back at the makeshift command post near the trees, Delgado sat cross-legged beside his radio, antenna angled toward the hills. He was only half listening to Rourke and Hayes, arguing over the next step when he heard something faint but clear, a few clipped phrases in German. But the strange part wasn't what was said, it was how it was said. The voice had an accent, American, slight, but there, almost like someone trying to mimic German, but not quite native. Delgado froze. He rewound the tape and played it again, leaning closer. The enemy voice repeated a string of words, then paused. There was a slight static burst and then a reply. 2 words, familiar one. North Pine. Delgado's eyes widened. That was the name Hayes had given to the forward tree line where they'd buried spare bolts just in case. They'd never written it down. It was something they'd whispered only once, a half-joke, just between 4 men. He ran to Rourke, breath caught in his throat. "Sir, I heard it. On their channel, someone on the other side repeated our marker, North Pine." Rourke's face hardened. "You sure?" Delgado nodded. "Absolutely." And there was something off about the voice, not fully German, like someone faking it. Hayes took a step back, the shadows under his eyes deepening. "That's it. I've had enough of this." "Easy," Rourke said. "We can't start turning on each other." "No, because someone here's feeding them everything we say. First they knew about our recon, then our gear goes missing, now one of our pontoons ends up floating down the river like a toy boat." Stern said nothing, just turned his gaze back to the river. Quietly he added, "If they know what we call the tree line, they're too close. One of us, or someone within earshot." Rourke looked over the team, tired, cold, trust unraveling by the hour, and the bridge unfinished, still stretching halfway into the river, like a question without an answer. The clouds above shifted, and the moon spilled faint silver light across the water. Rourke turned toward it, thinking hard. "We finish what we can. No more names, no more chatter. From here on, everything goes through me." Hayes bit his tongue, nodded stiffly, and stomped off toward the equipment pile. Delgado sat down, still shaken by what he'd heard. Stern stayed where he was, eyes drifting to the shadows. Behind them, the river kept moving. And somewhere across it, someone was listening. The night would not last forever, and the enemy, emboldened by secrets, would not wait much longer. The boom shattered the silence like a thunderclap, tearing through the forest and lighting the riverbank in a flash of orange. For a second it looked as if the stars themselves had fallen. Then came the sound of crashing metal, steel against steel, followed by the sudden terrible groan of something giving way. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke spun around just in time to see a large section of the bridge, almost a quarter of what they had built, crumble and fold into the river. The twisted frame twisted and buckled, vanishing into the swirling current below. Sergeant Will Hayes raced to the edge, shouting orders, but no one could hear him over the roar of the water. Sparks floated in the air. The sky had gone quiet again, but the damage was already done. Then a voice cried out, "Stern!" Rourke rushed toward the edge where a few men were huddled. In the chaos, Corporal Levi Stern had gone back onto the bridge to retrieve the rolled blueprints stashed under a support beam. Now he lay on the cold planks near the water's edge, clutching his side and coughing through the dust. Rourke knelt beside him. "Stay still, you're all right." "I got the plan," Stern said through gritted teeth. His fingers clutched the charred edges of the scrolls, didn't want them floating down to the other side. Rourke took the blueprints gently and handed them to Delgado, who handled them like something sacred. Hayes stood over them, face dark. "This wasn't stray fire. Someone set that blast." Rourke agreed silently. The damage was too clean, too specific. The charge had been placed under a primary brace, the exact one Hayes had reinforced just hours before. "Lock it down," Rourke said, rising to his feet. "No one comes in or out of this site, not until we find out who did this." Hayes called out the order, and within minutes the perimeter was sealed. The bridge was now a fractured skeleton, swaying half-complete over the roaring water. Time was slipping away fast, and with every minute they lost, the risk of discovery grew. Inside the gear tent, Stern lay on a cot, wrapped in a blanket. His face was pale, and his voice softer now. "There was someone," he said slowly. "Earlier, before the explosion, I saw a man step into this tent. He had a soaked greatcoat, dripping water. I thought it was just someone drying off. But now..." Rourke leaned in. "Did you see his face?" "No, Just the coat and the boots, but he moved like he knew this place. He didn't hesitate. Hayes gritted his teeth. He sabotaged the gear, planted the charge, then slipped back like nothing happened. They didn't have to wait long. Private Tomas Delgado, who had been sweeping the trade line, returned with 2 others dragging a man between them. It was Private Ron Aldridge, a logistics runner from the rear supply post. He looked soaked, pale and cornered. Found him near the west slope, Delgado said. Looked like he was trying to flash a mirror across the river. He swears it was just to check the weather. Aldridge shook his head furiously. I wasn't doing anything. I just stepped out to get fresh air. That's all. Rourke stared at him. Where were you during the blast? I was at the truck. Sorting bolts, I swear. Hayes stepped forward, voice sharp. You've got no reason to be near the river unless someone told you to be there. Who sent you? No one. Aldridge snapped. I don't know anything about a charge or a blast. I just ran supplies and tried to stay out of the way. Rourke watched him closely. The man was shaking, but it wasn't just fear. It was something else. Hesitation? Shame? Or was he hiding something deeper? Stern, from the cot, raised his voice faintly. It wasn't him. Everyone turned. I don't think Aldridge is the one I saw. The man I saw was taller. He moved differently, confident like he had authority. Rourke took a slow breath. Then someone else is still out there. Delgado's face tensed. If it's not Aldridge and it wasn't one of the boys pulling duty on the outer lines, then someone higher up. Hayes finished. Someone we trust. That thought settled over the group like a fog. The kind of silence that makes men question every glance, every shared word from the past week. Aldridge spoke again, desperate now. They told me to take a message up the line. A man, I didn't know his name, handed me a note back at the supply shed. Said it needed to reach the front. When I read it, just out of curiosity, it had a sketch of our bridge, the layout. I burned it. I swear. I didn't know what I was carrying. You remember his face? Rourke asked. Aldridge nodded. Beard, sharp eyes, not one of the engineers. Definitely not a grunt. Rourke turned to Hayes. How many officers have passed through here in the last 2 days? 3. Lieutenant Darrow from Operations, Captain Bowers for Resupply, and Captain Hale from Engineering Command. Hale, Rourke repeated. He asked for our bridge layout last night. Said he wanted to confirm it matched central planning. Stern narrowed his eyes. That's the name. He's the one I saw near the gear tent. Same walk, same posture. Hayes' hands curled into fists. So we've been watched the whole time, played from inside. Rourke nodded, but his voice was quiet. And we just accused the wrong man. He turned to Aldridge. You're not going anywhere. You stay here, guarded. For now you're clear. Aldridge sagged in relief as 2 guards posted near him. Outside, the river rushed on. The bridge was in pieces. The enemy still watched from the far side, and somewhere in the darkness behind their own lines, a man wearing the same uniform as them, someone with access, with knowledge, with the trust of headquarters, was waiting to finish what he started. Rourke stepped outside, the cold wind tugging at his coat. The stars had returned, distant and cold. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself, we finish this bridge. We just hoped they'd still be standing long enough to cross it. The dim glow from the lantern flickered across the canvas walls of the small command tent. Outside, the cold wind carried the sounds of creaking metal and rushing water. Inside, Private Ron Aldridge sat hunched over, his fingers laced tightly, shoulders sagging. He looked like a man who'd run out of places to hide. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke stood across from him, arms crossed. He hadn't said a word in minutes. He didn't need to. The silence was heavier than any accusation. I didn't have a choice, Aldridge finally muttered. Rourke's gaze didn't waver. Then, help me understand. What choice did you think you had? Aldridge looked up, eyes red. They found out about my brother. Stephen, he was captured months ago somewhere near Aiken. I hadn't heard anything until a few days ago. Then a man in a gray overcoat said he was with some neutral organization, shows up at the rear post with a message, claimed Stephen was still alive, but only if I followed directions. Rourke narrowed his eyes. And the directions? They told me to deliver sketches, notes, nothing obvious. One was about our gear inventory, another about river depth. Then tonight, I got the drawing of the bridge. They said if I didn't send it across, I'd never hear from Stephen again. Rourke paced slowly. So you started feeding them piece by piece, hoping it would be enough. I never meant to hurt anyone. Aldrich said quickly. I thought maybe I could protect him without causing real harm. I didn't think they'd act this fast. You were the crack in the foundation, Rourke said softly, and we all nearly paid the price. Aldrich looked away, silent. Later, in the shadow of the collapsed bridge, Rourke stood beside Sergeant Will Hayes, watching the moonlight ripple across the damaged frame. The night air was cold, but neither of them noticed. He was scared, Rourke said. I could see it in his eyes. It wasn't about betrayal, it was desperation. Hayes scoffed. Doesn't change the fact that someone used him to gut our chances. We've lost hours, and the current's picking up. Reinforcements won't wait for us to finish a fairy tale. Rourke didn't respond right away. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn dog tag, turning it over in his hand. Back in Sicily, he said quietly, I had a guy in my unit, smart, dependable. The kind who never spoke unless it mattered. One night we caught him snooping near the fuel depot. He claimed he was double-checking storage logs. I didn't push it, thought it was harmless. 2 days later, the depot went up in flames. Hayes turned to him. You never reported it? I buried it, Rourke admitted. I thought I was protecting someone who'd made a mistake. We lost 5 men in that fire. I've carried that silence ever since. Hayes looked away, the wind rustling the trees behind them. So what? You think we just forgive Aldrich because you didn't act back then? No, Rourke said, but I know what it's like to hold a secret too long, to think silence is safer. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of men hammering in the distance drifted over the river. Every blow echoed like a heartbeat. Back at the makeshift command area, the engineers were restless. Word of the sabotage had spread. Whispers floated between men. Suspicion tightened like a noose. Trust was unraveling, thread by thread. Delgado sat beside Corporal Levi Stern, who still winced every time he moved. We're wasting time, Delgado said. If they know we're here, they're watching. Probably waiting for the next mistake. Then maybe we stop before someone gets hurt again, another soldier chimed in. We don't even know if the crossing is possible anymore. Voices rose. Arguments flared. Rourke stepped in, calm but firm. Enough. All eyes turned to him. I know what some of you are thinking, that it's over, that we pull back, wait for a new plan. But listen to me. This bridge isn't just a crossing. It's the only way our side keeps momentum. Every hour we waste gives the other side more time to fortify. Delgado frowned. But what if they sabotage us again? Rourke looked around. Then we adapt. Watch each other's backs. We double-check every crate, every tool, every post we drive. No one moves alone. No one works in the dark. Hayes stepped beside him. We've come this far. If we stop now, everything we've endured means nothing. The group fell quiet. Rourke's voice softened. I know trust is shaken, but if we let that stop us, they've already won. I say we finish what we started, no matter who's watching. Stern nodded slowly. We're engineers, we build, even when everything around us is trying to break. That night, as the stars blinked overhead and frost crept across the canvas tents, the engineers returned to the ruined frame. Hammers rose again, wood creaked, steel groaned. And somewhere beyond the far bank the enemy watched, waiting for the bridge to rise from the water once more. The cold night settled over the river like a thick, suffocating blanket. The engineers worked quietly at first, their tools whispering against wood and metal, trying to coax the bridge from the dark waters. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke stood close to the edge, eyes scanning the far bank, alert for any sign of movement. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a warning. Suddenly the stillness shattered. A distant thud echoed through the valley, then another, and another. The enemy was probing, testing the defenses, artillery shells screaming across the sky before exploding in bursts of flame and smoke, near their positions. Get down, Rourke barked. The men dove behind whatever cover they could find. Concrete slabs, twisted girders, the hull of the submerged ferry they'd found earlier. The riverbank seemed to shudder as shells crashed and sent up sprays of mud and debris. Private Tomas Delgado pressed himself flat against a chunk of concrete. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew the bridge had to be finished. Without it, the whole mission was doomed. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard the sharp crack of bullets zipping through the night air. Sergeant Will Hayes was near the makeshift scaffolding, trying to steady a beam. His face was pale but set. Keep moving, men. No stopping now. Suddenly a low, rumbling explosion ripped through the night close to the water's edge. A mine, hidden and waiting. The blast threw several men off their feet. Shouts filled the air as the dust settled. Rourke scrambled to the scene, heart racing. 2 men lay still, unconscious, their bodies battered by the force. Medics rushed forward, but the damage was clear. The explosion had taken its toll. Hayes clenched his jaw. "We're losing ground fast. If that's just a test, what's coming next?" Rourke didn't answer. His eyes locked on the enemy lines across the river, where flares now ignited the dark, casting long, jagged shadows. The Germans weren't just attacking, they were searching for a weak spot to break them apart. Delgado's thoughts raced. The radios crackled weakly, but no clear messages came through. The command post had to know what was happening, had to be warned in time. With the half-finished bridge stretching precariously over the churning water, he volunteered to make the crossing, radio gear strapped to his back. Rourke shook his head. "It's too dangerous." Delgado's jaw tightened. "If we don't warn them, we're all done for." The lieutenant hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful." Delgado rose, steadying himself against the swaying beams. The bridge creaked beneath his weight. Bullets whipped past, embedding themselves in the wood and metal. A flare burst overhead, briefly illuminating the fragile crossing. Halfway across, a sharp crack split the air. A sniper's bullet struck Delgado's leg. He stumbled, nearly falling into the dark water below. Pain seared through his leg, but Delgado gritted his teeth and pressed on. Inch by inch, he made his way across, each step heavier than the last. His breath came in short gasps, his body screaming to stop. When he finally reached the far bank, he collapsed behind a battered wall, radio crackling faintly in his hands. "We're under heavy fire," Delgado gasped into the microphone. "Bridge under attack. Sabotage suspected. Urgent reinforcements needed." The command post responded with static and faint voices. Relief washed over Delgado as he held on, waiting for their reply. Back at the riverbank, Rourke watched Delgado's silhouette fade into the darkness. Hope mingled with fear. The night was far from over. As the artillery fire continued, another terrifying realization took root among the engineers. Their enemy was not only attacking from across the river, they were being watched from within. Signals intercepted by Delgado earlier made sense now. Someone close by was guiding the artillery, relaying real-time information about their movements and positions. Every plan, every step was no longer secret. "Traitor," Hayes growled under his breath. Rourke gathered the remaining men, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We tighten security, watch each other's backs, no one out of sight, no one alone." The night became a battlefield of shadows and whispered warnings of hurried repairs and desperate defenses. Every moment the engineers held the line, the bridge inched closer to completion. But with every explosion, every bullet, every stolen second, the question burned hotter. Who was watching, and how long before their secrets led to disaster? The firestorm raged on. The river did not forgive, and neither would the men standing in its cold, dark grip. The night after the firestorm left the engineers shaken but determined. Sergeant Will Hayes couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. The sense of betrayal, the kind that ran deeper than any enemy's attack, burned fiercely inside. His instinct screamed that the mole was closer than anyone suspected, and it wasn't just some low-level informant. Hayes sat by the dwindling fire, sifting through the scattered papers and equipment from the sabotage site. His sharp eyes caught something others missed. A set of orders and coordinates, worn and hastily folded, hidden beneath the remains of a broken crate. The handwriting wasn't from any of their engineers or frontline officers. It belonged to someone with authority, someone who had access to the plans but whose loyalty was now in question. He memorized the name on the orders: Captain Wallace, a man who worked behind the lines overseeing logistics and communications, trusted by many but lately suspicious. Hayes didn't waste time. He found Lieutenant Marcus Rourke and pulled him aside, voice low and urgent. "Marcus, I think I found who's been feeding the enemy." Rourke frowned but nodded. "Show me." Together, they studied the documents by the firelight. The orders were not just false, they were deliberate lies. They included exact times and places where their defenses were weakest, enabling the enemy to strike with terrifying precision. Worse, the coordinates matched the locations of recent shelling and sabotage. "This isn't just a leak," Hayes said grimly. "It's a double cross." Rourke's jaw tightened. "We need to confront Wallace, quietly." They moved carefully through the camp, alert for any prying ears or wandering patrols. When they reached Captain Wallace's tent, the tension was thick enough to cut through. Hayes knocked once, then pushed the flap open without waiting for an answer. Wallace was there, sitting calmly on a cot, the faint glow of a lantern casting long shadows on his face. His eyes held no surprise, only a cold, unsettling calm. "I suppose you found my little secret," Wallace said quietly, voice steady and almost resigned. Rourke stepped forward. "Why, Captain? Why sabotage your own men? Why betray us?" Wallace looked out toward the river, his expression distant. "Because this war, it's lost. I've seen what's coming. The endless fights, the lives wasted for a cause that's already failed. I'm not a traitor. I'm a realist. Delaying this advance might save lives, save what's left of us." Hayes's fists clenched. "You don't get to decide who lives and who dies." Wallace's gaze hardened. "I do what I must." Suddenly, Wallace's hand moved toward the side of his cot. Rourke saw the glint of metal, a pistol. In a split second, Hayes acted. The sharp crack of a single shot broke the silence. Wallace slumped forward, motionless. The weight of what just happened settled heavy on them. Rourke knelt by the captain's side, searching for any sign of life. But it was clear, the betrayal had ended. But the cost was not just one man. It was the fracture of trust in a team already stretched thin. There was no time to grieve. The enemy's shelling continued to hammer the riverside, and the bridge still needed to be finished before dawn. Rourke stood, voice firm and commanding. "From now on, I'm taking charge of everything. No more secrets, no more mistakes. We finish this bridge, no matter what." Hayes nodded, his anger now focused. "We'll make sure every step they take is met with steel, and we'll..." As the night deepened, the men pulled together with renewed purpose. The shadow of betrayal still lingered, but so did their determination to cross the river, to survive, and to push forward. The enemy had an insider, but the engineers had something stronger, resolve forged in fire and tested by trust. Now the hardest part was ahead, the final hours before the dawn, and the river's crossing that would decide their fate. The night felt colder than ever, as if the chill in the air matched the weight on everyone's shoulders. The river's roar was relentless, and the enemy's distant gunfire hammered like a constant reminder. Time was running out, but Lieutenant Marcus Rourke and his team knew there was no turning back. The bridge had to be finished. The advance depended on it. Corporal Levi Stern moved slowly toward the work site, each step a struggle. His ankle had swollen badly after the explosion, but the pain didn't stop him. His mind was sharper than ever, fueled by a fierce determination to see the mission through. Despite the injury, he pulled out his notebook, worn and soaked, and began sketching new support beams and braces. The blueprint was delicate, but he knew exactly what was needed. The half-finished structure wouldn't hold under the enemy's growing pressure unless they reinforced it in a way that balanced weight and flexibility. Rourke was already at the water's edge, sleeves rolled up, welding steel beams while standing in the icy river. The freezing water bit into his skin, but he didn't hesitate or pull back. He was the anchor for the team, calm, focused, refusing to let anything stop him. Sparks flew as he fused metal, the faint glow illuminating his determined face in the darkness. "We can't lose this bridge," he muttered, steady and sure. "Not now, not ever." Nearby, Sergeant Will Hayes crouched behind a partial barricade, his hands steady even as enemy snipers tracked their every move. He had scrounged up several German explosives left behind in their hasty retreats, and now used them to secure the bridge's supports. Every charge was set with precision, a dangerous game of balancing the weight needed to hold the bridge without alerting the enemy too early. The sniper fire was relentless. Bullets splintered the wooden planks around him, but Hayes didn't flinch. His jaw was tight, eyes locked on his task. He worked fast, knowing that every second counted. Private Tomás Delgado moved cautiously across the muddy bank, carrying radio equipment patched together from damaged parts. His legs still ached from the earlier encounter, but his resolve was unbroken. He sent quick bursts of communication upstream, coordinating with the rest of the forces and warning them of the enemy's movements. Every call felt like a lifeline. Then, just as they thought the night's labor would hold, the sound of enemy boots echoed through the trees on the far side of the river. The Germans were mounting a desperate attack, a last-ditch attempt to stop the bridge from being completed and destroy what had already been built. Their plan was bold, dangerous, a direct assault across the river to sabotage the crossing. The engineers tightened their grips on their tools, hearts pounding. The riverbank became a battlefield in the dark, shadowed by the black silhouettes of advancing soldiers. The noise of gunfire, shouts and splashing water filled the air, every moment tense, every breath held. In the chaos, Stern saw his chance to make a difference. Though injured and slowing down, He carried with him the last explosive charge. If the enemy succeeded in crossing, the bridge would be lost, and with it, the hopes of the entire mission. He knew what he had to do. "Go," Stern shouted, voice clear despite the pain, as he sprinted toward the bridge's core. Rourke and Hayes shouted warnings, but Stern was already moving, focused on detonating the charge at the critical point that would delay the enemy's advance just long enough. He reached the spot, set the charge, and triggered the fuse. The explosion rocked the riverbank, sending a shockwave through the water and forcing the attackers back. Stern held on, pushing his body beyond its limits to keep the charge in place, buying precious seconds. On the other side, Rourke and Hayes took advantage of the pause, rallying the engineers to push forward with renewed energy. They secured the last beams, reinforced the weak spots, and finally connected the shattered span. When the dust settled, the bridge stood battered but unbroken. The cost was clear. Stern collapsed as the explosion faded, exhausted but alive, his sacrifice keeping the enemy at bay. Rourke knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. "You held the line, Levi. We couldn't have done it without you." Stern smiled faintly, eyes reflecting the rising dawn. "It's not over yet. Finish the bridge. Finish the mission." As the first light of morning touched the river, the engineers stood together, weary but victorious. The bridge was their lifeline, a pathway to freedom, hope, and the next step in the fight. And though the shadows of the night still lingered, the dawn promised one thing: they had crossed the impossible. The first light of morning bled slowly into the sky, casting long streaks of pale orange across the river's surface. Mist curled along the water like rising smoke, mixing with the grime and haze of the night's final push. The bridge stood at last, scorched, splintered, reinforced with mismatched timber and salvaged steel, but whole. It was not elegant. It was not perfect, but it would hold. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke stood at the near end, shoulders slumped from exhaustion, his uniform soaked with oil, grime, and streaks of something darker. His eyes, bloodshot and unblinking, scanned the length of the span as the rumble of engines stirred behind him. The silence that followed the chaos of the last few hours felt alien, almost too calm, but it wouldn't last. Then came the deep, groaning churn of tank treads grinding into motion. The first Sherman crept forward, its silhouette ghost-like in the fog. The massive machine eased onto the bridge, every bolt and joint groaning under the weight. Engineers paused their work and held their breath. For a moment it seemed the span might buckle. It didn't. The tank rolled across, slow and steady. Then another, and another. Infantry followed, boots stomping in rhythm, their silhouettes swallowed by smoke. These men didn't cheer. They didn't raise fists or wave. Their faces were hard, focused, quiet. They had seen too much to celebrate early. But they moved with purpose, because the bridge, this impossible bridge, was their path forward. Rourke didn't move. He stood statue still at the edge of the crossing, one hand resting on a rusted beam, the other hanging limp by his side. His gloves were torn, his knuckles scraped raw. He'd welded until his arms went numb, had shouted through the wind and shelling, had dragged steel into place when no one else could. His mind was still racing with measurements and load limits, with Stern's last sketch etched into memory. Behind him, the remnants of the engineer team gathered. Sergeant Will Hayes sat on an overturned crate, eyes narrowed beneath his helmet. He glanced toward the river, then toward the far bank. "Looks like it's holding," he said, voice gruff. Rourke nodded but didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Private Tomas Delgado limped up from the slope near the radio post, cradling the damaged field unit against his chest. His jacket was ripped, stained with ash and water, and a bandage clung stubbornly to his leg. He knelt beside the radio, adjusted the frequency dial with trembling fingers, and pressed the receiver to his mouth. Static. Then a faint click. He exhaled slowly and spoke in a hoarse whisper. "Bridge secure. Mission complete." A moment later, a soft voice on the other end replied. Barely audible, Delgado gave a weary smile, and let the receiver drop gently to the ground beside him. The engineers exchanged glances. For the first time in days, they could breathe, but no one smiled for long. The cost of their success lingered like a weight in the air. From further down the line, a small group of infantry paused to help carry Stern's stretcher toward the rear lines. He was pale and barely conscious, his leg tightly braced and his hands still clutching the notebook filled with his final sketches. Every engineer stepped aside as they passed, heads low, silent in respect. Hayes stood and moved to Rourke's side. "They'll hold the crossing," he said quietly. "Reinforcements are already moving. We've done our part." Rourke nodded, his voice barely audible. For now. The distant sounds of artillery echoed again, muffled thuds followed by low vibrations through the ground. On the far bank, smoke rose in thick pillars as the infantry pushed into the enemy's second line. Tanks continued to rumble past one after another, leaving deep imprints on the bridge that hadn't existed a day ago. Hayes stared out across the span, his jaw clenched. We bought them hours, maybe more, long enough to make the difference. Long enough to matter, Rourke replied. Delgado slowly pulled himself to his feet and joined them. His voice was barely above a whisper. They'll write about this someday. Maybe, Rourke said, but no one will believe it. Behind them, the engineer camp was already being broken down. Tools packed up, stretchers loaded, the few remaining tents folded. They weren't staying. This place wasn't meant to be held. The bridge had one purpose: to be crossed. Rourke took one last look at the structure. He saw it not just for what it was, but for everything it represented. The hours of silent labor under threat, the bruised hands and unspoken fears, the courage of men who'd built with nothing but scraps and grit, the final sketches of a wounded genius, the calm voice of a young radio man who never gave up. The bridge wasn't steel and timber. It was them. The river continued to churn beneath, as cold and fast as ever. The smoke thickened on the horizon. Somewhere up ahead, more orders would come. More towns, more missions, more rivers. But for now, in this sliver of dawn, they had done the impossible. And no one, not the traitor who nearly unraveled them, not the officers who doubted them, not the storm of fire that had rained from the far bank, could take that away. Hayes picked up his gear and slung it over his shoulder. You ready, Lieutenant? Rourke gave one last look to the line of tanks and men disappearing into the fog ahead, then nodded. I'm ready. As they turned to follow, the wind shifted slightly, carrying away the last of the night's ash. The war rolled forward, but the bridge remained scarred but standing, a monument to those who refused to break. The smoke had settled, but the silence was heavier than before. The sun sat higher now, casting longer shadows across the battlefield. What had once been a frantic construction zone was now quiet, a graveyard of shattered tools, twisted beams, and scorched earth. The bridge still stood, defiant against the river's current, but its builders were gone. Some moved on with the advancing units, others would never move again. Lieutenant Marcus Rourke sat alone inside what remained of the engineer's command tent. The canvas flapped gently in the wind, one side torn open from the shelling. His boots rested beside a broken cot, his coat draped over a dented chair. In his hands he held a small, dirt-smeared letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, methodical, etched in pencil on water-stained stationery. Stern's name was scrawled at the top, barely visible beneath the folds. Rourke had found it wedged inside Stern's tool bag, tucked behind a worn ruler and a folded blueprint. He read silently, his brow furrowed. Dear Mom and Dad, if you're reading this, I guess I didn't make it through. But don't worry, I wasn't scared. Well, maybe a little, but I had good people beside me. Real good. I helped build something out here. Not just a bridge, something bigger than that. Rourke paused, closing his eyes. He could still hear Stern's voice, soft, a little too fast, always excited when talking about load weights or structural torque. He was young, too young, and yet he'd held them all together in the final hours. Tell Anna the design held. Even with the crazy adjustments, it worked. I wish I could have shown her in person. A lump formed in Rourke's throat. He folded the letter carefully, returning it to the envelope. He wouldn't send it. Not yet. Not until he figured out the right words to go with it. Some letters were meant to be read at the right time. Outside, Hayes paced near the edge of the river, his coat open, one hand gripping a metal flask he hadn't touched. In his other hand he held something small and fragile, a photo. It was creased and faded from sweat and time. He stared at it for a long time. It showed Captain Wallace standing beside a woman and two children, probably taken before the war. Wallace looked younger then, lighter, as if the burden hadn't yet taken root in his shoulders. The woman smiled. The kids held toy airplanes. Hayes exhaled slowly. He'd seen Wallace's eyes the night before, calm, resolved. Even as he confessed, not hateful, not proud, just tired. He wasn't born a traitor. Something in the war had changed him, broken him. We're all carrying something, Hayes muttered under his breath, folding the photo and slipping it into his pocket. Even the ones who can't carry it anymore. A sharp hum broke the silence as the evacuation helicopter swept over the ridge, descending slowly into the clearing near the riverbank. Dust and debris lifted in waves, fluttering canvas and rattling crates. Medics rushed forward, helping Delgado into the stretcher. He protested, of course, said he could walk, but his leg was too far gone, and even he knew it. Still, as they lifted him into the chopper, he twisted just enough to glance back. The bridge loomed behind him, burnt and splintered, patched in desperation, but proud. Delgado raised a shaky hand and gave a slow salute. The chopper lifted, circling once before fading into the morning sky. Back on the ground, the world was returning to order. Cleanup crews sifted through the rubble, trucks moved in supplies for the advancing forces. New units arrived, never knowing the chaos that had unfolded only hours before. To them, the bridge was just another checkpoint. But Rourke knew better. Later that evening, as the sky turned copper, Rourke walked down to the riverbank. The ground crunched beneath his boots, a mix of scorched stone and damp soil. He stopped where Stern had stood, drafting under fire. The final support beam still bore the chalk outline of his diagram, now smudged and rain-worn. Rourke knelt beside it, brushed the dust away with his hand. "Held better than any blueprint," he said softly. From the ridge above, Hayes watched silently, arms folded, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The camera would pull back now. If this were a film. Rising slowly over the trees, sweeping across the ruined riverbank. The wreckage of crates, scattered helmets, personal items, dozens of stories left behind. The cost of what had been built, paid in silence. But through it all, the bridge remained, bent, charred, and standing. As night crept over the battlefield once more, Rourke turned toward the span and whispered the only eulogy it would ever need. "Some bridges are built with steel, others with courage." He paused. "Some with silence, and some," his voice faltered, but he finished, "with sacrifice." Then he turned away, walking back into the twilight, the bridge fading behind him like a memory never truly forgotten. If you're proud to be an American and honor the bravery of our true war heroes, hit that subscribe button, because these untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and grit are just the beginning.